And know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat. George Herbert wrote that a person may sleep or wander during sermons and prayers, but when asked a question, he must discover what he is. I'm not going to indicate quotations. Every now and then I'll go like this. But when it's really, really good, it's Herbert, and when it's just regular prose, it's me. So you should be able to distinguish. The Catechist asks, question, do our own works deserve nothing at God's hand? Answer, no, for they are his own works in us. Herbert's sense that a person will discover what he is when answering a question is thus not a promise of the triumphal discovery of one's own unique specialness or even of self-knowledge. Instead, that discovery is a form of self or ego abnegation, an experience that, if misunderstood, can feel like self-erasure, rather than participation in that great pre-modern mystery of being individual from God, which meant in Herbert's time the opposite of what it means now, being inseparable, undivided, one. In many of the poems leading up to the one I'm going to talk about today, the last in the Temple, Herbert's speaker is at once, and these are all quotations from his poems, which are all amazing, even though Love 3 is the best. The speaker is at once a short-breathed man living out his inch of life with doubling knees and weary bones. In one poem, he writes that, quote, a blunted knife was of more use than I, and what he calls rebel flesh, it's a hyphenated term, asserting his freedom and his will. I will abroad, he cries in The Collar, which is maybe his most famous poem. I will abroad, he cries. My lines in life are free, free as the road. Only someone who reads the entire volume of The Temple will recognize the intentional badness, the cliche of those lines, free as the road, which points to the paradox of a kind of seeming freedom, throwing off the collar or yoke of devotion and service to God, that is in fact loss. The formally tidiest, the tiniest little bits of Herbert's poems tighten in on the interdependence of God's thine and the speaker's mine, showing quite literally the dependence of one on the other. In one poem, God holds the speaker's hand while the speaker writes, making no thine and mine. In the altar, which is the most famous shape poem in the volume, the speaker's mine settles tidily down on top of God's thine in the final rhymed couplet, which is also the basis of the altar and is also in the shape of a capital I. In Love 3, we're presented with stories or dramas that bleed into one another. In one of those stories, a kind and gracious host, perhaps a host at an inn, or a lord at a great house, receives a weary and self-conscious traveler, dirty from their trip. The host offers the guest his hospitality, soliciting polite, even assistant, demurrals that eventually resolve in the guest sitting and eating a meal. Like a parable, the story includes an allegorical meaning signaled from the very first word. And like a parable, it invites some work on the part of the reader, even as it makes it easy for them. Herbert was critical of poets who wrote obscurely, catching what he calls the sense at two removes. The welcomer is not actually the host of an inn or the lord of a great house welcoming a weary pilgrim. The speaker is actually love, capitalized. And the reluctant pilgrim may be there in body, whether he likes it or not, but it's his soul that draws back from love, guilty, as the speaker recounts, not just of dust on the road, but from the sin which both makes the human being, that is, original sin, and the dust of the flesh that may or may not receive resurrection. The story is then not really keeping secrets from us, even as it unfolds in its dramatic form. It does not distinguish between those capable of penetrating divine mysteries or reading darkly or at one remove from those who can only get the most basic meaning, the easiest meaning, the most generous meaning, or who can just get the gist of it. The meaning is right there for us, freely available to all. The host in the poem is quick-eyed. And Herbert does things with adjectives, particularly compound adjectives, like nobody else. The host in the poem is quick-eyed or perspicacious, like an eager keeper of a commercial establishment or a really, really fine host looking to read the room. Noting that despite his always open door and his very warm welcome on its threshold, the speaker is nonetheless reluctant to come in. He thus comes closer, asking what the visitor lacks. The pun here is that just as a dusty traveler lacks appropriate presentability to come into an inn or a great house, that he needs something from the proprietor to make it so. What do ye lack was the cry of early modern shopkeepers or street peddlers. Lacks or needs that can be answered by simple gifts or simple purchases. So does the soul, guilty of sin, feel that he lacks worthiness for what love offers him. The guest answers the host's questions by shifting its tenor into a different register altogether. What do I lack? A guest, he answers, worthy to be here. It's a witty turn, even an assertive one, responding to a polite pro forma welcome, the offer, say, of a warm washcloth before a simple meal, by turning it into an existential and indeed self-referential dilemma. What the guest feels he lacks is self-worth to be at the Lord's table. The poem begins in the past tense. It's a dramatic narrative, but it's told in parable time, a story time that has already happened. But the second stanza begins with recounted direct speech. A guest, I answered. And for the first time, the guest occupies the long pentameter lines in the poem. So if you just look at the long ones here, I'm going to talk about this a little bit, but in the long lines, the pentameter lines as opposed to the trimeter lines, in the first stanza, you see love and the speaker sort of joined in clauses, right? What you get in the first pentameter line of the second stanza is sort of the willful assertion of the guest. In the first stanza, note, as I just said, how the speaker and guest meet and join clauses. In the long lines of verse, they are joined by marks of punctuation like semicolons. Love responds to this line, you shall be he, offering a simple reparation of the split self of the actual guest, right? The actual guest, the worthy one. The host, that is, rejects the false separation with his own assertion. If we are paying close attention, though, we will note the verb form, shall. Love does not say politely, oh, you are worried, you are totally worthy, don't be silly. He says you shall be that worthy guest. It's both an imperative and a promise, not the conditional should, right? You should be or you could be that guest, right? If you tried a little harder, for example, but the immediate future tense, the having it be so. The next long line in the stanza, also the guest, begins in the first person with an I, a stronger assertion of self even as it doubles down on unworthiness. He responds to the host's second personing him as you by saying I, the unkind, ungrateful. The two words claim the absence of kinship and goodness on the one hand. Think of Hamlet's a little more than kin and less than kind. And on the other hand, the lack of grace and the lack of gratitude, the ungrateful on the other. Ah, my dear, he sighs, I cannot look on thee. The guest's return here puts the two of them in a different kind of clausal relationship to one another. The I estranged and distanced from the thee at the end of the line. The guest's return here not only wrenches the focus to himself, but turns what had been a kind of gentle comedy of manners, a host's gracious invitation, and a guest's conventional and wholly expected demurral into something that seems more like a debate over a bone of contention, say, straining the rules of courtesy and asserting power. The guest's desire to play a role in the unfolding story. The guest's my dear, a slightly patronizing term of endearment, endeavors to put the host in a different position, to suggest, say, reciprocity or an exchange of obligations, to even the playing field. You are sweet to me, the guest says. I will be sweet to you. What began as a comedy of manners, that is, becomes a battle of wills. An imperative dispensing host, you shall be he, asserting polite yet insistent sovereignty over a self-critical yet self-asserting guest. When the guest says that he cannot even look at his host, the host takes his hand and smiling, this is a crucial act, smiling. Whenever anybody smiles, it's always a little bit of the Mona Lisa. And smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? This moment reads like something of a trump card or a mic drop. I made the eyes that you can't look at me with. I own you. Love, whose heroic epithet in an earlier poem called The Glimpse, is full-eyed love, looking right at you, full of tears, is in Love 3 rendered, despite his quick-eyedness, rather steely-eyed in his all-knowingness, offering a version of the stern parental, I gave birth to you, didn't I? Which, as most of us know, always solicits resistance from our children. I'm just speaking for myself. What the guest lacks to be worthy of coming in, love already gave to him a long time ago, even before he was blinking up from his crib. In the poem's third stanza, the allegory that began as a gentle comedy of manners and morphed into a battle of wits or a battle of wills turns it up yet another notch. Truth, Lord, the guest demurs, with an even greater self-assertion, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. This is the last line of pentameter that the guest speaks in the poem. Note how the word that ends the line, shame, with its action of downcast eyes, shamefastedness, is enjambed or continues over into the next line. Let my shame, what exactly? Let my shame be registered? Let it be? The sentence proper ends with an assertion of merit, deserve, right? The paradox here is that the speaker wants his deservings, what he's earned, even if it's bad. In Paradise Lost, Satan calls this bad eminence. Satan wants to be honored for his bad eminence, his bad merit, right? He wants his worth to matter in what is happening to him, even if it registers as an unworthiness. The poem dramatizes the steps through which self-denial can become self-assertion, showing how the doctrine of faith alone can be undermined not only by assertions of merit, but by assertions of unworthiness. The assertion of unworthiness in the face of graciousness may be expected, but also strains the contract, the courtesy of grace. By this point, we likely recognize that the host's graciousness here is a figure for grace, the divine bounty freely offered, given for nothing but faith alone. Love comes back with an even stronger feint. And know you not who bore the blame? We can't help but see him as peremptory here, even imperious. The alliteration of the plosives, bore and blame, cannot be read gently. This is not my point. This is Helen Wendler's point. There's something of a spit in the face. The gracious host seems to know it all. He seems to be a know-it-all, a seen-it-all, an I did-it-all, and it's easy to forget who he is in his noblesse oblige landlord self, that actually what he is a gracious host. Milton does this in When I Consider How My Light Is Spent too, where he's talking about God and he says, his state is kingly. And you know, Milton was a king killer, right? He was part of the execution of Charles I. He hated kings, he hated tyrants, and he sort of pushes this up against the idea of God being kingly because he knows it's something that his countrymen resist. even rebel against, right? So he pushes it to that understanding. We can mistake the gracious host, that is, for a kind of tyrant, one who denies us the rewards, negative or positive, for our works, any sense of our own merit, good or bad, who denies us the meaningful exercise of our free will, who's just a kind of puppet master. The guest's last feint in trimeter, we will notice, uses the verb will in precisely this little nestled paradox. Then I will serve, he says, an assertion of will here that is a pun. I will do that, I will serve now, going forward, and I will it to be so. The guest's will is a rebuttal to the host shall. His second my dear here is both plaintive, please, and not quite capitulative. A host who won't take no for an answer must be pled with. His desire to participate agentively is, like the assertion of his unworthiness, an insistence on his mine, his right to stand alone. Love has the poem's final line of pentameter, responding to the guest's I with the second person you, putting him back into place, and with an imperative verb, must. And he speaks in the present tense. You must sit down, says love. Students often laugh at this moment. The combination of love's imperative, you must sit, right? Love on top, love is the boss. And the sexy punginess of taste my meat makes them uncomfortable. I imagine most of you discovered the other implicit pun in the poem. Neither the word grace nor the word host actually appears in the poem. They're just implicit. The host who welcomes the weary soul is also the communion itself. The host, eat this in remembrance of me. And this is where Herbert really pulls the rug out from under us. The imperious host, whose graciousness is so irresistible, is giving his own body for the guest to eat. So if Luke 12 says, and I'm just going to read Luke 12, a bit of Luke 12 and then a bit of Mark 14. Luke 12 says, blessed are the servants whom the Lord, when he cometh, shall find watching. Verily I say unto you that he shall gird himself and make them to sit down to meat, and will come and serve them. That's not what's happening. What's happening is more Mark. Take, eat, this is my body. In an earlier poem, Herbert writes rather decorously that God is the feast in whom, quote, all dainties are. In another, the speaker asks, where's the taste of my inheritance? And the speaker of the pilgrimage notes that after so foul a journey, death is fair and but a chair. The notes often say that chair here is a luxurious mode of conveyance, a sit-down chair, say, carried by people. But it's also the French word for flesh. Regardless, the form of sitting that it offers is quite polite. The cannibalism and the sexual communion here is something different altogether. The invitation at the end is one that makes us even more uncomfortable. Okay, so that's the end of my close reading, and I'm happy to sort of talk about the poem more generally and any questions that you might have, or we can dig into that final line.
Excellent. So if you have questions and you're watching online, I encourage you to use Facebook. You can write them in the comments on YouTube. You can write them in the live chat, or you can email me, pthompson@stbarts.org. That's pthompson@stbarts.org. If you're in the room, you can use all of those methods, but we also have question cards right there on the table, and Excel Bagumo is going to collect them, and she's going to send them to me if you have a question for Professor Crawford. I wonder if we could start, as we're waiting for those questions to come in, with a little bit of Herbert's biography. And I remember when I was your student, we talked a lot about George Herbert being a kind of lowly parish priest, as well as kind of going to the cathedral, and this struggle of his ambition, and you see that struggle in this poem, his really high hopes and high feelings about himself, as well as his desire to demure. I'm wondering if you can reflect a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, he came from a fancy family, like a very fancy family. His brother was an ambassador, I think ambassador to France, and he was kin to the Herberts, who were the dedicatees of Shakespeare's first folio. So William and Philip Herbert, who were among the most sort of decorated and influential courtiers in all of sort of Jacobean England. So yeah, he was born in a really fancy family. He went to Cambridge, and he became the orator there. He was a great persuader and arguer. And yeah, was given all sorts of offices, but he famously chose to renovate a little tiny parish called Bemerton. And he spent his whole career there and wrote another book called The Country Parson. And we can talk about what he says in that about the difference between kneeling at the feast of the communion and sitting at the feast of the communion, because he has a whole argument when he says that we should kneel. But this is a poem obviously about sitting. So we can talk about that. Yeah, so he spent his whole life at this small parish. But there's also a story that comes into that, which is that he was very much hagiographed by the Church of England to become their sort of patron saint, and there's a long tradition of sort of denying the obvious ambition in his poems, right? He says in the poem that begins the whole volume, "A verse may find him who a sermon flies," right? That verses can do things, and he talks explicitly about turning his poems away from love poetry, which was the sort of form in which ambitious courtiers advertised their rhetorical and inventive skills, to poems of God. John Donne did it too, and John Donne became one of the most powerful prelates in the Church of England, right? So there's sort of this work to make him into a patron saint that sort of denies, I think, some of the more radical aspects of what he's actually doing in the temple, with both his sort of homely metaphors and his modes of acknowledging the sort of daily wrestling that people went through. That answers it.
Can you talk a little more about the temple as a larger work and how it's structured? And there's also, someone has submitted a question about who is the audience of this poem, and I guess also of the temple in general.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the thing I love about the temple, and that's why I was hoping we were actually going to be in the church, that's my own vainglory, is because the first poem you meet when you come in the door of the temple is the altar. And in no Christian church is the altar right inside the door. So Herbert is sort of making a point that it is freely available to all. It's not railed off, it's not on a pedestal, it's sort of anti-high church, right? Even at the same time as the sort of altar. That's the poem that has his mine on top of the vine at the base of the sort of altar, right, that I talked about at the beginning, is right inside the door. And so when you go through the temple, you're not just going through the liturgical year, but you're sort of going through the various forms of church furniture that are either can be seen as forms of exclusion. You guys sit down there below the railed off Holy Communion, or you come and sit at the table with me and eat, right? So he has a poem called Church Furniture in which he deals with that. And because where it's all happening, the temple is not actually in the temple, it's happening in the temple of the human heart, right? Know ye not that my body is the temple of the Holy Spirit. So it's all happening in here. It's all metaphorical, right? And so the progress that you make is a progress through the various forms of sort of bloody wrestling that the human heart, its pumping blood, sort of goes through. In thinking about basically just an ongoing thinking again and again and again about the sacrifice, about the communion, about what it means to participate.
So who read the temple, and
Right.
who, what kind of message was he trying to send to those folks in this poem?
Famously the first readers were the people of Little Gidding, which was sort of a religious community nearby. And there's 2 extant manuscripts, and one of them was possessed by Nicholas Ferrer, who was sort of the head of this community, which was largely a community of women who sort of read and collated the Gospels. They have these amazing, what they call the harmonies. So those bits that I took of Mark and Luke, they would sort of cut and paste different Bibles and put them into this amazing, it's like the Henry Darger of Christianity. They would cut and paste them and put them into a harmony to harmonize the Gospels and the different stories they told. Little Gidding was mocked as an Arminian nunnery, but they were his first readers. So his first readers were these women, largely women and men at this little community. But, these were really good poems, obviously. They circulated widely in manuscript. They were read. Manuscript was a form of circulation. They were handed from, he saw them as his kind of calling card, right? For sort of, you could see it as sort of advertising his skills in a mode and a way of thinking and living and inviting people to the table that was very different than, say, what his brother was doing in his ambassadorial exercises, or what Philip and William Herbert were doing by patronizing the works of Sidney and Shakespeare. He had a different agenda. But I think the readers he presents them with the dialogue, right? It's not doctrine, right? Doctrine is easy. In Paradise Lost, when God gives the doctrine, it's all really simple and straightforward, right? God is like, da-da-da-da-da, One injunction, and you guys are heirs of the whole world else besides, and Adam and Eve are all like, well, that's really, really easy. But of course, the extent of Paradise Lost is that Adam and Eve actually live in human time. They get hungry, they get thirsty, they have to move through the world. And doctrine comes to seem actually really, really complicated when it's human experience, embodiment, intellect that are having to engage doctrine, right? And it's also kind of important that Milton doesn't make God seem very nice. God is absolutely not he seems kind of like a jerk up there, dispensing on a high, not aware of what we go through. Whereas Satan is like us. Satan is full of angst, and Satan wants to be seen, self-begot, self-raised, So I think that by making it a dialogue, he's sort of saying, like, come and engage your own little battle of wits, because that's what we're doing anyway,
You mentioned the influence of the Gospels, Mark and Luke. One person wonders about other scriptural influences, specifically if Proverbs and the idea of wisdom offering a banquet had any influence on this poem.
Well, I'd say that the big one here is the Psalms, right? You prepare us to table for me in the presence of mine enemies, right? But the enemies are the self, right? They're within you, right? So, I mean, if there's none here, but, in the collar, the last line of the collar is, my child, like that he cites God all the time, usually in italics in the temple, that, the words of the scriptures are interwoven. They speak the speaker. Often, right? That they make him, just like who made the eyes but I, who bore the blame, right? That the words of the scripture actually speak, like that amazing image that I said at the beginning, where he says that, God held his hand when he was writing so that there's no difference between mine and thine, right? The idea of being a vessel, the idea of being a servant for that. So, but yeah, I mean, you would know more than me. But most people in this room would know more than me. But yeah, he's absolutely engaging psalmic wisdom, proverbial wisdom. He begins with a bunch of proverbs. The line, a verse can find him who a sermon flies. Like people are like, no sermons, but a verse maybe. Those are all very proverbial in the church porch, like how you sort of come in. That's Proverbs, right? This easily citational, memorable, memorizable bits of wisdom. We're like, okay, I've got the bits of wisdom, right? And now I'm going to go across the threshold, sprinkled with precepts, right? And I'm good to go. right? I'm good to come in and understand all the mysteries of the church and all the liturgical things, but as we all know, if precepts did the work, we'd all have a much easier time, right? It actually happens in these forms of sort of wrestling and interpretive crisis.
When we talked about you coming here, this is the first poem that came to mind, and you said you always wanted to teach it to people of faith. And I'm wondering if you can reflect on why that was so exciting to you, as well as how do people who don't have faith read this, and what do you think the differences are in how readers come to this poem?
Well, I'd say two things about that. The first thing would be that once, when I was teaching, a student said, "You sound like a preacher." And I was like, oh, yeah, I can see that. Like how the enthusiasm for something brilliant can seem like a form of proselytizing, right? Or it can seem like an attestation of personal faith. Like, I was talking actually to Rachel the other day about how, when you read something really difficult or upsetting, like say you read Paradise Lost, or you read a devastating novel, and your experience at the end of it as somebody who sort of loves literature is like, oh my God, it's so amazing. But if you recommend it to somebody, like, why did you give me such a depressing book? That ends so unhappily. And you're sort of caught up in the brilliance of the articulation or the complexity of the theology that you're not sort of there, right? And so partly it was my sort of saying, oh, well, what is that effect? What is that in me, and what is that about? The other thing I would say, though, why I want to teach it to people of faith is that when you teach it, my experience of teaching in the classroom, the implicit puns in the poem, grace and host, the students only get at that at the end. They're like, oh my God, the host is the host. That's the bread you have in the communion. But I assumed you guys would get that from the beginning, right? Some of you would get that from the beginning. Same with the idea of grace, and that what does it mean to sort of already get the story that is spelled out for us if we're paying attention in the first two lines, right? To get it right away, and then how are you experiencing that poem that's different than when it's a pedagogical thing that often just requires actually teaching the tenets of faith in addition to teaching the sort of unfolding story and the multiple levels on which the poem works. Does that make sense? Right? So did everybody get that the implicit puns were host and grace from the beginning? Anybody just halfway through? Anybody not till the end? Nobody's giving it away. But, those were some of my interests in teaching this poem.
Why do you think this poem, out of all of the others in the temple, is the one that still speaks most obviously to people of faith in this day and age? I mean, this was just an anthem in our services 3 or 4 weeks ago. Multiple composers have set it to music. Why do you think this one stands out, and what qualities of it really speak to our day and age?
I mean, it's a good question. I always think the one that I used to love the best is the caller. I struck the board and cried, I will no more, I will abroad, right? That idea of sort of rebel flesh, that hyphenated word that Herbert likes of rebel flesh, that idea of sort of rebelling against what it means to be under the aegis of some story that is not yours, it's bigger than yours, right? And that the rebellion, then the inevitable maybe rebellion is what's interesting. I mean, I think this one, it's the last one in the volume and maybe speaks to people because it includes that sort of rebellion within a really loving remit, right? That also allows, frankly, the display of Herbert's incredible inventiveness. Like, I really mean it about the mic drop. Like, I do think that there's, and that's not sort of undermining the theological intelligence or the welcoming to all kinds of readers that I also see the poem as having, I think it's just really, really, really good, right?
It's a great poem.
Yeah.
We still have a few more minutes for questions, so please, by all means, use Facebook, YouTube, email, or again, if you're in the room here, you can fill out a question card, and Excel Baguma will get me your questions.
Or you can just say it really loud, maybe.
That's true. We'll repeat it for those
you don't want to move.
on live stream. There is a question. Someone wonders about, notice that you mentioned Little Gidding, and wonders about the connection between Herbert and T.S. Eliot.
Yes. I mean, the what do you lack sort of appears in not the Love Song of Jay, but sort of in the Wasteland. It sort of appears like Eliot totally knew these poems. But, you know, I'm no Eliot person. I'm sure there's somebody in the room who knows more than I do. But Eliot was sort of also responsible for the sort of Church of England Anglican sort of ownership of Herbert as their poet, right? Rather than sort of a more, you know, he could be read as a more Puritan-y kind of poet. Like I think the thing that he says in do I have time to read the thing in the Country Parson? So what he says is, the feast requires sitting because it is a feast, but man's unpreparedness asks kneeling. He that comes to the sacrament hath the confidence of a guest, and he that kneels confesses himself an unworthy one, and therefore differs from other feasters. But he that sits and lies puts up to an apostle. Contentiousness in a feast of charity is more scandal than any posture. So fighting about it, right, whether you're supposed to sit or kneel, is stupider, is more scandalous, is more disrespectful of the sacrament than either posture, either the kneeling or the sitting, right? That's things indifferent. That's the idea that there's stuff that just doesn't matter. And that stuff that doesn't matter either means that we leave it up to Peter to decide for us, or we leave it up to the powers that be to decide it for us, or it just doesn't matter, get over it, right? And that kind of insistence can be seen not, therefore, as the service to church telling us what to do with our bodies, but actually to what could be read as a more Puritan or radical or high church critical posture. And that's, I think, part of the resilience of Herbert, too, is that the high church people can claim him and the low church people can claim him, right? Having been tenant long to a rich lord, I went to ask him if I could get a new lease, and he granted it immediately and died, right? That's Redemption, another really great Herbert poem, right? Is he really, the reason that there's what they call the religious wars in Herbert criticism, where you have high church people claiming him and low church claiming him, is because it's absolutely within the verse, right? There's a lot of scholarship right now on Herbert, the ways in which Herbert actually deeply critiques noblesse oblige and talks about spare cupboards and don't eat too much, right? This idea of like a kind of abstinence that is about social justice, or dispensing your riches in a way that brings more people to the feast, right? Metaphorical, literal, that we could understand him as being actually quite socially radical, right? And quite critical of those who engross or enclose the commonwealth, right, for themselves and their own appetites. And I believe that. Like, I really believe that, right? I think he also he constantly uses the term sugared sweets, of thinking about sort of the luxury and elitism and privilege that has to do with the worst forms of luxury consumption, sugar coming absolutely directly through colonization and enslavement. So I think he is thinking very seriously about those issues. I think he can completely rightly be read as sort of a social justice advocate, you know, if you want, all right?
What are the similarities and the differences between Herbert and John Donne, another 17th century English poet cleric that I know you teach as well?
Yeah, I love him, maybe even more. I mean, well, the point that I made earlier is that Donne actually accepts, right? He is told he is only, James I, the King of England, until 1625, basically tells him directly, you know, if you want to get anything, you've got to take orders, right? Donne does not sign the Articles of Religion of Conformity, so he never gets a college degree. Do you know who does sign the Articles of Religion and conforms? John Milton. He signs the Articles of Conformity, right? John Donne doesn't, but John Donne nonetheless is obviously amazing and wants high office and he moves up. What is he, St. Paul's? Dean of St. Paul's,
Yeah.
is that right? Right, so very top of the hierarchy, right? So he goes there. And Donne is actually most famous for his sermons, right? The greatest sermon writer of all time, no offense to the rest of y'all. But Donne's poems also circulated heavily in manuscript. There are like 335 extant manuscripts of Donne's verse, and people remade them and rewrote them. He circulated really widely. He was a court poet in a way that Herbert wasn't. I mean, Herbert's did circulate, but this is from, as I said, there are 2 extant manuscripts. And this is from the 1633 edition, which was published after his death. So the circulation that we know for sure about Herbert was within Little Gidding, within the Bemerton community. You know, a verse may find him who a sermon flies, right? Whereas Donne, I mean, Donne was really a superstar in his own time, both as a poet and as a sermonizer. And he, you know, inhabited the dean of, he was as high as you can get as a sermonizer in the nation, whereas Herbert made it this active choice to serve at Bemerton, which was like, I don't know, it was tiny, right? Like 30 seats, 40 seats. It was a tiny, smaller than this, right? It was a tiny church, and that's where he spent his career, like from basically a young man on, right? Whereas Donne was like shot to the top, right?
Herbert checked his ambition a little more.
Well, does that look like somebody checking their ambition? I mean, the thing I would say, the difference between Donne and Herbert is Donne, you know, the famous thing that whoever said, I can't remember at the moment, said about Donne is that his conceits, his radical images yoke disparate things by kind of violence together, right? You get this surprise. You're like, whoa, wait, the lover's eyes are like beads threaded on a string? That's crazy, right? That's sort of a breaching of decorum, a sprezzatura, sort of showing off of a different kind, right? Whereas what I think is, and this is not my point, this is other people's point, is that, you know, Herbert really gives his stuff away up front. It was a sort of argument I made about, you know, he spells out dust and sin. He spells it out from the beginning. Like, you can see the levels on which I'm working. I'm not trying to game you, right? I'm also not trying to blow your mind. You're, right? That you're going to understand my metaphorics through things that are easily recognizable by the lives of people who live in a small parish church. What it means to have a landlord, right? What it means to be cold, hungry, wet, you know, blown through. What it means to experience depression. What it means to feel that you are as useless as a blunt knife. I don't know about y'all, but I've felt that at times, right? So, you know, he's sort of sticking in a more, you know, the imagistic universe of the parable, and the imagistic universe of what it means to be somebody without a lot, right?
So we are at time, but I'm going to fit in one final question. Someone wonders about your own journey as a scholar with Herbert.
Right.
What surprised you the most about Herbert that you didn't know going into this, and what first attracted you to him?
Well, I said, you know, I was just talking about my undergraduate major earlier with Rob, and I was an English major, and I went to McGill at the end of the 80s. There was one pre-modern requirement. There was one pre-1800 requirement. So my last semester, I wrote my senior essay on Toni Morrison. My last semester, I had to take a pre-1800 class. So I took a class on 17th century poetry, and I met John Donne, and I was like, what? Why did nobody tell me this existed? Right? Like, it absolutely blew my mind. And that's when I met Herbert as well. And I was just like, you know, I was reading a lot of confessional poets, so I really like I was reading like Sylvia Plath, like sort of what a 19, 20-year-old reads. Like, I love Sylvia Plath. And this had a lot of that energy, but it also had a whole intellectual system, basically a theology, that I was secular. I am secular, right? It was not something I knew. And I was like, the intricacy of it and the intense, like, you know, passion of it just sort of, you know, blew my mind. And so, you know, I remember when I first taught this poem and I went to the library and I looked at 17 different scholars' readings of this poem. I was like, let's see what other people say about it, right? It had that kind of exegetical, like, kind of, like, being in communion with minds across a long expanse of time, right? that I think reading poetry has, you know. So it's a gift that keeps on giving, you know.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Crawford, for sharing your reflections with us today. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. The forum will not meet next week. It is annual meeting Sunday, so the annual meeting will be in the church during this time. In 2 weeks, we will be in Lent, and we will be joined virtually on March 6th by Brother Curtis Almquist, who is of Society of St. John the Evangelist in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So, and he will introduce us to the season of Lent. So looking forward to being with you all then. We hope you'll join us in 2 weeks, and we hope you'll join us for worship in just a few minutes at 11 a.m. Thank you again.
Thank you so much for coming. You can keep the poem.
Souvenir.
My gift to you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're so lovely.
Bishop Dean Wolf, the rector of St. Paul.
Hi, so nice to meet you.
Great to have